Hey everyone, this is Matthew, aka Sentient Number 6, and in this video I'm going to be going over the basics of hi-hats. When it comes to psytrance, I'm going to talk about some workflow tips as well as sequencing and a little bit of processing as well. So here's kind of like a demo loop that I've written for the sake of this tutorial. So there it is. As you can hear, it's pretty busy. There's a lot of variation going on in here. So I'll talk about kind of how I build up these sequences piece by piece. But before we do that, we have to talk about the drum rack. So this is something that I think saves me so much time when it comes to writing music because it basically spares me the effort of having to look for the sounds that I want for a track. Right? Like I'm sure everyone's been there where you're trying to write a track and you need some hi-hats and you end up wasting a lot of time just kind of clicking through all your sounds, kind of looking for whichever one might sound best for that context. So what I do is I make drum racks in advance. Before I even sit down to make a track, I'll just have a session where, let's say I just made a bunch of new sounds or I got a new drum library from someone or somewhere. Right, I'll make a drum rack with all those sounds because it makes it much more practical to find the sound that I'm looking for when I'm writing music. So I'll just drag an empty drum rack into this MIDI channel here, and I'm going to use these LP24 audio hi-hats. These come from a sample pack that I made a while back. I'll leave a link for it in the description if you want to check it out. But basically, this is like 20-something one-shots. And if I just click the first one, hold shift and click down to the bottom, it selects all of them. And I can just drag them onto the first key of the drum rack down here, and it will automatically load them up. So this is super handy to have because now you can rename this whatever you want and then save it. And it'll create a preset in your user library, and it's very easy to find down the line. If I were to just go to Instruments, and then Drum Rack, and I click the triangle to open it up. There it is, Forest Hats, the rack that I just made. So anyways, let's go back here. Now that I have every single one of these sounds in a drum rack, it's a lot easier for me, so I'll just take this clip here, just for demonstration's sake. It's very easy for me to audition sounds now, because if I have a pattern that I've already written, it's simple enough to just click the key, and that'll select everything that's on that one note, and then just use the arrow keys to shift around. And so if I bring the kick back in, right, I can now hear like how these would sound in context with this pattern. And so, yeah, that for me, that's much faster than dragging sounds, audio clips one by one into the project and kind of zooming in really far and then arranging them out one by one. So doing it like this speeds up my process a lot. Another thing that's super helpful about drum racks is macro controls. So what I like to do, I'm not going to go through and do it for this whole thing, but basically, if you click on each individual sound, you can see that the drum rack is basically made up of 128 simpler instruments, right? If you're familiar with Ableton, they've got this instrument down here, the simpler, and the drum rack is basically a host for the simplers. So anyways, what I do is if I right-click the transpose knob down here and then say map to macro 1, it'll create the macro control on the left side over here. So what you can do with this is you're basically, if you go through and click every single sample in your drum rack and do the same thing over and over, right-click, map to transpose, right-click, map to transpose, you're essentially mapping the pitch shifting of each of these hi-hat samples to one knob. So what this lets you do is essentially change the whole character of your entire drum rack with one knob. So basically if I shift the transpose down by 2, you get a bunch of different characters out of the same batch of sounds. And so this has actually allowed me to use the same handful of drum racks for 10 plus tracks at this point. These LP24 hats have taken me quite far. And yeah, it's just fast because I can get different sounds endlessly pretty much by different combinations of transposition and whatever samples I'm choosing to use for that track. And the drum racks also allow for further tweaking in that you can use either trigger mode or gate mode. And so the difference with that is trigger mode will always play the whole sample, right? If I press the key, it's always going to play the entire sample. If I use gate mode, it's kind of hard to hear because it's such a short sound anyways, but if you use gate mode, then the sound will only play for as long as the note length, if that makes sense. So as soon as you take your finger off the key, the sound would stop. So that's helpful for making more like staccato and short sounding hi-hats, while also having the contrast of longer sounds in the mix. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this drum rack because I've already made one that's completely mapped up here. I'll go ahead and take off all my plugins for now. And I guess one more thing that's really helpful about drum racks is that you still have the ability to process each hi-hat individually, right? So you see, if I click on this third sample here, I've got this this Soundtoys EQ, just kind of boosting some mid-range, it looks like, on this one hi-hat. And it's a little tricky to get the hang of, right? Like if I drag it outside of the drum rack, it becomes just like a normal plugin in the sequence, right? You can see that. But you can drag these plugins individually, right? You see it get this blue line after the simpler on that section of the drum rack, and now that plugin is only affecting this one hi-hat. And you can also unfold this in the mixer view. Every drum rack will have this little arrow here, and then that will expand it, and you'll actually be able to see every single hi-hat sound in the drum rack as its own mixer channel. And so in the same way, you can also add plugins to individual sounds. So yeah, let's go back over here. So here's the pattern again. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and mute that one for now, bring it down here, and I'll start from scratch, kind of making a fresh pattern. So I like to start with just like a 1-bar phrase to begin with. So what I just did there is if you highlight a selection on the arrangement window and you hold Control and Shift, it's probably Command and Shift on a Mac, and then press M, you'll create a new MIDI clip in the selection that you've highlighted. So yeah, now I can go ahead and start writing. So immediately, because it's a 1-bar pattern, I have a very detailed grid, right? Like I have a lot of grid points, so I just like to right-click in here and then set it to 30-second notes for hi-hats, because it lets me see more clearly where things are visually. So I'll start to kind of just click in some notes and make a similar pattern to what I had before. And I'm just double-clicking on each of these notes. You can also press B on the keyboard, and that gives you a pencil, which will just let you draw in notes with a single click. So yeah, let's see what this sounds like. Cool, so pretty similar to what I had before. And so let's talk about making this groovier. Another advantage of having things in drum racks is that it automatically maps velocity, like the MIDI note velocity, to the volume of each hit. And so that allows you to get a lot of dynamics out of sounds. So what I like to do, especially when I'm doing these little 30-second note bursts, is I like to create some velocity changes, because if you think about like how a drummer actually plays drums, right? Like no two hits are ever exactly identical. Sometimes we want that in psytrance, right? Sometimes you just want that constant 16th note hi-hat with the offbeat and it just goes and doesn't change. But for a pattern like this, I like to add some dynamic variation. And so again, if you press B and it turns your cursor into a pencil, you can draw in the velocity window here as well. And so you hear how that initial roll, it now ducks in volume as it goes through each note. And I'll just take kind of yeah, I'll just go through and kind of take random notes and duck their velocities down like this. So I was just holding Shift there to add to my selection with highlighting, and then I can click the velocities and bring them all down together. And so now, even though I'm only using one sample, I have a lot of groove and dynamic in the pattern already. And you know, you could also experiment. Like I think in this pattern I was using 2 samples. Yeah, I'm using 3 and 5. So let's just do that. Because we have a drum rack full of hi-hats, we can take specific hits and just move them to different hi-hats. So yeah, that's really, really cool. And if I wanted to make this pattern longer and more complex, what I like to do is I'll click on the whole clip and then either Control D on Windows or Command D on Mac to duplicate it. Then I hold Shift, click the first one, and then press Control or Command J to consolidate them both into a new clip. And so now I have something it's the same clip twice, but now I can create variations quite easily. And because I've already got these little note rolls programmed, let's just kind of drag them. I'm just dragging things around sort of arbitrarily, not really thinking about how it's going to sound. I'm just, you know, experimenting, basically. So yeah, you know, I'm still moving notes around. Maybe let's add that one there. And then I can do that exact same thing again, where I click the clip, duplicate it, and then consolidate with the previous one. And then I can add variations on the second half. So maybe on this one, I'll do this. And maybe some more 30-second notes, because who doesn't love these? Yeah, so now we've got a 4-bar phrase that has a decent amount of variation and change. And you know, maybe you could take this further just by, again, taking a sort of arbitrary selection of notes and then moving them to a different sound. So maybe let's take this second burst here and move it to an entirely separate hi-hat. Yeah, so now we've got a pretty groovy pattern that doesn't appear to be very repetitive, but at the same time, it's relatively simple to write this from starting with just a single 1-bar phrase. And so if you remember that macro control that we have with the transpose, we can also automate that very easily. So I'll click on the very first thing in the chain, which is the LP24 hats 2 drum rack that I'm using, and the controls that it gives me are the macro controls for automation, so transpose is already there. And so this is really cool because now I can select like an individual selection and then just boost the transposition, you know, just kind of experimenting at random to see what kind of variations you can get out of the same pattern. So let's hear how this sounds. Yeah, so again, it's just, it's pretty subtle because I'm not transposing them super far high or low, but it's adding subtle variation, which is kind of like, I'm all about finding ways to add that easily within a track. So yeah, that kind of does it for this video. I will definitely be making some more videos showcasing some, I guess, a bit more advanced techniques and approaches with percussion and effects. I know I didn't really talk about the plugins so much, but in this case, it's not super relevant. I'm basically just using 2 distortions with very low amounts of dry wet, and then a simple EQ to take out the lows and tame some of the highs. It was like only like a 2 or 3 dB cut on the highs because these distortions were adding some highs back in. So kind of just taming that down a bit. And then this compressor, just there to kind of catch the peaks and even out the dynamics. So yeah, that does it for this video. I will see you all in the next one.